I mean, it does feel like they're going to go through a slow, deliberate process and take their time on this. And, I think you see the first few candidates show that they're thinking outside the box a little bit. Dan Pitcher and Aiden Durde are very well thought of, very, very well regarded with their teams and, as people too. And so, I think, like that shows that the Browns have done their research.
On this, John Harbaugh's not coming to Cleveland, guys. Now, having said that, I do think there's merit in reaching out for an interview, but probably not for the reasons that you think. Somebody who knows what they're doing needs to be honest with the Browns. And if you can get someone who has won a Super Bowl, who is coached for almost 20 years in this league, who's won 300 games in this league, to come in and tell you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, that is a win. So for that reason, yeah, bring him in. And if his agent is able to leverage the entire world knowing that Jimmy will go full Jimmy, you can use that to get more money for John out of New York, do it. It's a win-win. So if John takes an interview in Cleveland and the rest of the NFL goes, well, he's probably not going there.
Albert Breer just issued a serious warning to John Harbaugh about taking the Cleveland Browns job, and what he said about coaching Shedeur Sanders should make every NFL insider nervous. When asked directly about the Browns situation, Breer didn't hold back. He admitted Cleveland isn't the most attractive landing spot right now, and flat out said, "I think they won't get him." But here's where it gets really interesting. Breer revealed that whoever takes this job will be walking into a minefield where the GM's future is uncertain, ownership loves to meddle, and the entire structure could collapse at any moment. And sitting right in the middle of all that chaos, Shedeur Sanders, a young quarterback whose development depends entirely on organizational stability that Cleveland simply doesn't have. The warning Breer gave wasn't just about the job, it was about the impossible situation any coach would face trying to develop Shedeur in this environment.
Depends on who the head coach is. I think if you're bringing in John Harbaugh, let's say they take their swing for the fences and they put it over the fence, right? Which I think would be grand slam hire for them. I don't think that it'd be the most attractive landing spot right now, and I think they won't get him. But let's just say for argument's sake, they get somebody like that, then I think you probably move forward with John Harbaugh, with ownership saying, let's see how this works with Andrew Berry. You know what I mean? Versus if it's somebody that was really kind of Andrew Berry's pick, well, then those guys are linked together. So I think it really does depend on who the head coach winds up being.
Look, when Albert Breer talks, NFL people listen. This isn't some hot take artist looking for clicks. This is one of the most connected insiders in football, someone who talks to coaches, GMs, and owners every single day. And when he goes on Cleveland radio and basically tells them, yeah, you're probably not getting John Harbaugh, that's not speculation, that's reality. But before we dive into why Breer's warning matters so much for Shedeur Sanders, we need to understand exactly what he said and why it's so damning for Cleveland's entire situation. The hosts asked Breer about the Harbaugh sweepstakes, and he laid out the landscape. Giants, Dolphins, Raiders, all teams with connections to Harbaugh, all teams that make sense. And then there's Cleveland. Breer's exact words, "Then I think the Browns, I guess, you try and take your swing if you're them, trying to pull on the heartstrings of, a guy whose roots are in Ohio with his dad and his mom." Read between those lines. You try and take your swing if you're them. That's not confidence, that's pity. That's Breer basically saying Cleveland's only hope is an emotional appeal to Harbaugh's childhood, not an actual compelling football situation. And then came the kicker. The hosts asked what it feels like for the Browns right now, and Breer said they're going to go through a slow, deliberate process, and that they're thinking outside the box a little bit with candidates like Dan Pitcher and Aiden Durde. But then, when pressed about whether Cleveland could actually land Harbaugh, Breer didn't sugarcoat it. I don't think it'd be the most attractive landing spot right now, and I think they won't get him. The most attractive landing spot. Translation, Cleveland is at the bottom of Harbaugh's list, if they're on his list at all. Now, why does this matter for Shedeur Sanders? Because everything Breer said after that reveals exactly why Cleveland is such a disaster for developing a young quarterback. The hosts asked Breer whether Andrew Berry, the GM, is on a short leash or has a long runway, and Breer's answer exposed the entire problem with Cleveland's power structure. He said it depends on who the head coach is. If they somehow land Harbaugh, then ownership would probably say, let's see how this works with Andrew Berry. But if it's someone who was really kind of Andrew Berry's pick, well, then those guys are linked together.
I'll answer that. I'll cop out and say I would actually advise Mike McDaniel to go take an OC job somewhere, unless it was a great head coaching job, because you generally don't get more than two chances at this. Some guys have gotten three, but you don't generally get two chances at this. And I do think there's great value for these guys. And look, it's hard, right? So if you're getting offered a head coaching job at 10 or 12 or 14 million, who am I to tell you to say no? You know what I mean? But I do think there's value for most of these guys in stepping back. And I look at it a lot of times the coaches who don't make it in their second chance are the guys who got second chances right away. And I can give you guys examples. Eric Mangini right there in Cleveland, Rex Ryan in Buffalo, Adam Gase with the Jets. And I think all those guys are good coaches. And all those guys, I think in their first stops, all three of those guys made the playoffs.
Then came the line that should terrify any coach considering this job. I think they still believe in Andrew Berry. It's just what does that power dynamic look like when you pick your head coach? I think that all depends on the stature of the coach coming in, the history of the coach coming in. Power dynamic. That's the key phrase right there. Cleveland doesn't have a clear organizational structure. They don't have a defined chain of command. Everything depends on the stature of whoever they hire. You know what that means? It means if you're not a Hall of Fame coach with decades of leverage, you're walking into a situation where nobody knows who's actually in charge. The GM might be running things, or ownership might be meddling, or the coach might have some control, but not total control. And you know who suffers the most in that kind of chaos? The young quarterback who needs consistency, stability, and a unified plan for his development. That quarterback is Shedeur Sanders. Now, here's where Breer's warning gets even more specific, even though he didn't mention Shedeur by name. The hosts asked him a question about Mike McDaniel that reveals everything about how the NFL insiders view the Cleveland job. They asked, if you were advising Mike McDaniel, would you tell him to take the Commanders' OC job or the Browns' head coaching job? Breer laughed it off as a trick question that would get him in trouble with Cleveland fans, but then he gave an answer that speaks volumes about how the Browns' job is perceived around the league. He said he would advise McDaniel to go take an OC job somewhere unless it was a great head coaching job. Unless it was a great head coaching job. Cleveland isn't even in that category. Cleveland is a job you'd advise someone to turn down in favor of being a coordinator somewhere else. And then Breer dropped some history that explains exactly why rushing into a bad head coaching situation destroys careers. He brought up Eric Mangini in Cleveland, Rex Ryan in Buffalo, and Adam Gase with the Jets. All three coaches made the playoffs in their first jobs. All three got second chances immediately, and all three failed in their second stops. Why? Because as Breer explained, when you get hired immediately after being fired, it immediately becomes, well, it was everybody else's fault. You don't do the self-evaluation. You don't fix your weaknesses. You just assume you were right all along and everyone else was wrong.
So, is Dylan Gabriel giving you the best chance to do that, or is Shedeur Sanders giving you the best chance to do that? And there was a gap there, and there's been a gap there. And so how does Shedeur Sanders close that gap? That has to happen Monday through Saturday.
And we've heard that it is. Again, it's an interesting thing. The other thing that I would say, we talk about, and I want fans to think about this, and I'll get your reaction to it as well, as I was listening to that. One of the reasons that people point to, oh, he missed that throw downfield. He missed this guy.
But here's what Breer said next that's absolutely critical. Whereas, like, if you have to go back and be a coordinator and you have to go back and kind of evaluate yourself and you fail to get a head coaching job, you're going to be more apt to look in the mirror and say, like, yeah, you know what? Like, I do need to fix X, Y, and Z. Now, connect those dots to the Cleveland situation. If a proven offensive coordinator like Mike McDaniel should turn down the Browns job to go be an OC somewhere else, what does that tell you about the job itself? It tells you that taking the Browns job is a career risk. It's the kind of situation that could derail your trajectory because the organizational dysfunction makes success nearly impossible. And if that's true for coaches with proven track records, imagine what it means for a 22-year-old quarterback trying to develop in that environment. Breer also addressed whether Kevin Stefanski got scapegoated, and his answer revealed another layer of Cleveland's dysfunction. He said, I think somebody probably had to pay for the back-to-back seasons that they just had. But then he added something crucial. I do think to some degree it's on ownership too. Like you have to, if you've got good people in the building, like you gotta kind of sort through that. He brought up Mike Vrabel in Tennessee as an example. The atmosphere in the building wasn't great. There was a divide between the Vrabel people and the non-Vrabel people. And instead of fixing the environment, ownership just fired Vrabel. Breer asked the million-dollar question, was that the right thing to do? Or should you have gone in and said, hey, we have a good head coach. How do we set this up differently where this will work better for him? That's the question Cleveland should be asking right now. Do they have organizational problems that would sabotage any coach? Do they have an ownership group that meddles too much? Do they have a power structure that's unclear and constantly shifting? Because if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then it doesn't matter who they hire as head coach, and it definitely doesn't matter how talented their young quarterback is. Shedeur Sanders could be the next Patrick Mahomes, but if he's in an organization where coaches don't have clear authority, where the GM's future is uncertain, where ownership interferes, where power dynamics shift based on who has the most stature, he's going to fail. Not because he can't play, but because the environment makes development impossible. And here's where we need to flip this narrative, because everything Albert Breer said is actually a defense of Shedeur Sanders, not a criticism. When Breer says Cleveland isn't an attractive landing spot, he's not saying it because of Shedeur. He's saying it because of organizational dysfunction, because of ownership meddling, because of unclear power structures, because of a history of failure that has nothing to do with the quarterback they just drafted. When Breer warns coaches about taking bad jobs, he's not warning them about Shedeur's talent. He's warning them about Cleveland's inability to create the conditions for success. When Breer points out that Andrew Berry's future depends on who gets hired, he's highlighting that Cleveland doesn't even know who's in charge, and you can't develop a quarterback when you don't know who's making the decisions. Think about what Shedeur's dealing with right now. He got drafted by a team that just fired their coach despite him winning Coach of the Year 2 years ago, kept their GM even though he made the worst trade in NFL history, Deshaun Watson, has an ownership group that's fired multiple coaches after 1 or 2 years, has a power structure so unclear that even insiders like Albert Breer can't figure out who actually calls the shots. And despite all of that chaos, despite all of that dysfunction, despite walking into one of the worst organizational situations in football, Shedeur still showed flashes of talent. He still made throws. He still demonstrated poise. He still proved he's got the tools. Imagine what he could do in a stable organization with consistent coaching and a clear chain of command. The problem isn't Shedeur Sanders. The problem is Cleveland has spent 2 decades creating an environment where even the most talented players and coaches can't succeed. Breer mentions that Cleveland had 2 winning seasons under the Haslams. One was 2020, when nobody was allowed around the football team because of COVID. He literally said it was no kink-dink that was the most successful year this team has had because nobody was allowed around the team. Read that again. Cleveland succeeded when ownership couldn't interfere. They failed every other year when ownership was involved. That's not a quarterback problem. That's not a coaching problem. That's an ownership problem. And Shedeur Sanders is the one paying the price for it. The hosts pushed Breer on whether Cleveland could land someone like Jim Schwartz or Tommy Rees, and Breer said they like both guys and the interviews are legitimate. But he also said it might be about keeping them on hand for the possibility that maybe one or the other would fit in with a new head coach. So Cleveland's interviewing their own coordinators, not necessarily to hire them, but to keep them around in case the new coach wants them. That's not a plan. That's desperation disguised as a process. And sitting in the middle of all this desperation is a talented young quarterback who deserves better than an organization that can't figure out basic questions like who's in charge and what's our plan. Breer's warning to Harbaugh isn't just about one coaching job. It's a warning about what happens when organizational dysfunction becomes so bad that even Hall of Fame coaches don't want to touch it. But here's the beautiful irony in all of this. The same dysfunction that makes coaches hesitant is actually proof that Shedeur's struggles have nothing to do with his talent. If Kevin Stefanski, a Coach of the Year winner, couldn't succeed in Cleveland, how can anyone blame a rookie quarterback for not being perfect? If John Harbaugh, a Super Bowl champion, doesn't want the job, how can anyone say the problem is the players Cleveland has? If Albert Breer, one of the most connected insiders in football, is warning people away from Cleveland, how can anyone claim the organization is set up for success? The answer is simple. You can't. Cleveland's problems have nothing to do with Shedeur Sanders and everything to do with an organizational structure that's been broken for 20 years. And until they fix that structure, until they create clear lines of authority, until they stop ownership from meddling, until they commit to stability instead of constant change, it won't matter who's coaching or who's playing quarterback. So when you see Albert Breer warning John Harbaugh about the Browns job, don't read it as a warning about Shedeur Sanders. Read it as confirmation that Shedeur has been set up to fail by an organization that doesn't know how to succeed. The kid's got talent. The kid's got tools. The kid's got potential. What he doesn't have is an organization that's stable enough to develop him properly. And that's not on Shedeur Sanders. That's on Jimmy Haslam and 2 decades of dysfunction that even the best coaches in football want nothing to do with. So here's my question for you. When an NFL insider warns Hall of Fame coaches away from a job, is it because of the young quarterback's talent or because the organization is so dysfunctional that even the best coaches can't fix it? If you want to stay locked in on how this Cleveland coaching search impacts Shedeur Sanders and whether he'll finally get the stability he needs to develop, hit that subscribe button right now. We're breaking down the insider information that explains what's really happening behind the scenes. Drop a comment and let me know. Does Shedeur deserve better than this organizational chaos, or should he be blamed for Cleveland's dysfunction? Let's talk about it.